Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Things They Cannot Say. Stories soldiers won't tell you about what they've seen, done, or failed to do in war, by Kevin Seitz. Narrated by Kevin Seitz. Dedication. This book is dedicated to my wife, Anita, and the rest of the party of 5, Tina, Cami, and Vay, for giving me the gift of being necessary. Author's note. The service ranks, units, and campaign deployments listed in the chapter headings reflect the timeline only for the stories depicted in this book. Some of those profiled are still serving in the military and have risen to higher ranks and have fought in additional conflicts. Those promotions and deployments are noted in their postscripts. Unless otherwise noted, email, social network messages, and texts are presented as they were written by their senders. I welcome your thoughts on the book as well as contributions of new stories from service members around the world that may be collected and published on a companion website. Please send them to me at thethingstheycannot@gmail.com. Epigraph. Hospital Pictures, number 1. A soldier looked at me with blue hawk eyes. With kindly glances, sorrow had made wise, and talked till all I'd ever read in books melted to ashes in his burning looks. Ivor Gurney, British soldier, World War I, poet, composer. From Ivor Gurney, War's Embers, Sidgwick and Jackson Limited, 1919. Introduction. The Killer in Me. In combat, inattention to detail can kill people. Karl Melantis, What It's Like to Go to War. I'm a journalist, not a soldier, but I've killed in combat. This is how I did it. I looked into the eyes of my victim as he begged for his life, lying before me, covered in nothing but a ripped shirt, white underwear, and his own dried blood. Then I shrugged my shoulders, turned, and walked away. I killed him with my indifference, as much as the 23 .556 NATO rounds that tracked his spine as he tried to crawl away that few minutes or few hours after I left him in that mosque in South Fallujah. I killed him without wielding a weapon, without being present, and without knowing that I'd killed him until 3 years later. It was only in that discovery, reading a heavily redacted Naval Criminal Investigative Service NCIS document about the incident, that I learned what I had done. Only in that moment, when the shaky stacked soapboxes of my belief system came tumbling down, did the other face of war reveal itself to me fully. Until then, I had been happily chasing the dragon, my addiction to war, mostly immune to its consequences. No longer. Like so many once young journalists, I was a danger dilettante. In 1986, at the age of 23, I traveled to Nicaragua as a passionate but clueless freelance reporter and photographer for an alternative newspaper to cover the U.S.-backed covert war against the leftist Sandinista government. I had $150 in my pocket, 10 rolls of film in a quart-sized Ziploc bag, and a tenuous grasp of even rudimentary Spanish. I was looking for that shortcut to foreign correspondent street cred, hoping to luck into a firefight, maybe to get a bullet graze, but obviously understanding nothing. My research about conducting myself properly in a war zone consisted of watching Oliver Stone's Salvador 3 times. Once in country, I headed to the infamous La Cita bar at Managua's Hotel Intercontinental and used my meager cash to buy bottles of local cerveza, Victoria, for new friends staying at the hotel. After enough rounds, I convinced them to allow me to crash on the floor of their room. Once oriented in the capital, I used a credit card to rent a battered old Toyota Sentra and drove north from Managua to the front lines with a Canadian Military Academy professor named Hal, who was kind enough to act as my interpreter and wise enough to realize that I was likely to get myself killed without his help. I remember weaving through rutted mountain roads on Christmas Eve when 2 Sandinista soldiers walking along the road stopped to ask us for a ride. Their green jungle boonie caps dripped water from the cowboy-style brims as they loaded into the cramped back seat. I eyeballed the iconic curve of the banana mags jutting from their AK-47s and smelled the smoke of the campfire that they had earlier tried to warm themselves with on that cold, rainy evening. Feliz Navidad, we said to each other, as I shifted into first, puttering into the cloud-shrouded darkness. In that moment, I had felt I had transcended my small-town Ohio upbringing and had become part of the larger world, one that was comprised of excitement, danger, and men with guns. While I never saw combat there, only its aftermath, villagers burying their dead following an attack, it was that first taste that would eventually help make war my heroine. I wanted to feel forever unburdened by the mundane realities of normal life, the way it was so perfectly illustrated by Catherine Bigelow in her film The Hurt Locker, when bomb tech First Sergeant William James is more disturbed by the sight of a well-stocked grocery store cereal aisle at home than of a massive roadside bomb engineered from daisy-chained 155mm artillery shells in Iraq. While it would be a decade before I got another real war fix, this time as a producer for NBC News, my high returned easily, and quite literally, as my feet dangled outside the open door of a Navy Seahawk helicopter, hovering over a U.S. destroyer in the waters of the Arabian Gulf, part of the U.S.-led post-Gulf War no-fly zone enforcement in Iraq. What kind of lucky bastard, I wondered, gets paid to be shuttled back and forth between battleships and aircraft carriers? A few years after that, I watched the start of the war in Kosovo, videotaping million-dollar tomahawks launched at the Serbian capital of Belgrade from the deck of the guided missile cruiser, the USS Philippine Sea. The killing I witnessed, up to and through Kosovo, had always been at a distance. I saw weapons release, but never their immediate impact. That changed for me during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Killing turns everything on its head. Watching people being killed, especially those you know, is a memory that can't be erased. But actually doing the killing, or being fully complicit in it, is a lifelong sentence to contemplate the nature of one's own character, endlessly asking, am I good or am I evil? And slowly growing mad at the equivocation of this trick question, whose answer is definitively yes. When someone kills in war, there's a psychological triage that occurs. The individual must find meaning in the act, because killing is the ultimate refutation of our own humanity. There must be a justification to prevent the mind from defaulting to the judgment of murderer. It's Private Joker trying to explain to the angry colonel in Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, a 1987 film about the war in Vietnam, as to why he's wearing a peace symbol on his body armor while he's written "Born to Kill" on his helmet. Private Joker: I think I was trying to suggest something about the duality of man, sir. Colonel: the what? Private Joker: the duality of man, the Jungian thing, sir. In his book, What It Is Like to Go to War, former Vietnam War infantry officer and Rhodes Scholar Carl Molantis ruminates on the killing he did and the dying he watched on his deployment to that nation during America's 10-year conflict there. He learned in the years after his service that coming to terms with death is essential, but it has also become increasingly difficult in our age of modern warfare, where death, for many of those meeting it out in Iraq and Afghanistan, has become an abstraction. Today, a soldier can go out on patrol, kill someone or have one of his friends killed and call his girlfriend that night and talk about anything except what just happened. And if society itself tries to blur that as much as possible by conscious, well-intended efforts to provide all the comforts of home and modern transportation and communication, what chance does your average 18-year-old have of not being confused? Marlantis believes that grief and mourning for those a soldier has killed, as well as for the friends and comrades he's lost, is key to the transformation that enables the warrior to find peace in the aftermath of battle. The absence of that grieving, which is often blocked by the numbing devices of alcohol, drugs, violence, and empty sex, leave the warrior mired in the past, living in the midst of his sins and an endless judgment of himself, hopeless and without salvation. And with more than 2 million Americans having served in one or both of the decade-long conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, if society does not address that problem, it could have crippling social and economic consequences for the United States, including substance abuse, domestic violence, crime, and the staggering medical and mental health care costs of providing for those veterans after their return and into old age. What is at stake is not just the psyche of each young fighter, but our humanity, according to Marlantes. He continues, "So ask the 20-year-old combat veteran at the gas station how he felt about killing someone. His probable, angry answer, if he's honest, not a fucking thing. Ask him when he's 60, and if he's not too drunk to answer, it might come out very differently, but only by luck of circumstance. Who was there to help him with the feelings during those 4 long decades after he came home from war? It is critical for young people who return from combat that someone is there to help them before they turn to drugs, alcohol, and suicide. We cannot expect normal 18-year-olds to kill someone and contain it in a healthy way. They must be helped to sort out what will be healthy grief about taking a life, because it is part of the sorrow of war. The drugs, alcohol, and suicides are ways of avoiding guilt and fear of grief. Grief itself is a healthy response. But grieving, by its very nature, requires remembering the past, recalling difficult memories, and confronting the ugly truths of what the soldier has seen, done, or failed to do in war. Denial becomes the mistaken coping mechanism for both the warrior and society. A psychologist deeply immersed in the world of returning war veterans, Dr. Edward Tick, writes in his book, War and the Soul, Healing Our Nation's Veterans from Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, that denial, rather than protecting us, widens that chasm in our mind about the good and evil of our nature and helps perpetuate our delusion that we really are only one or the other and cannot possibly harbor within ourselves both forces. What are we denying about our war-making? We deny our own complex human nature, writes Tick, including our capacities for greed, evil, and doing harm, clinging instead to the belief in our own innocence and goodness. Headlines from the war front reinforce this notion. When we learn of a U.S. Army kill team staging fake ambushes to kill Afghan civilians for a thrill, or Marines videotaping themselves urinating on the bodies of dead Taliban and then posting the clip to YouTube, paratroopers staging macabre photos with the body parts of suicide bombers, or an Army staff sergeant leaving his combat outpost in the middle of the night in southern Afghanistan and proceeding to kill 16 civilians, including 9 children. Our first reaction is, that can't be our people. We're the good guys. And as Tick and other experts point out, the next step in the process for communal and individual self-preservation is to try to forget the incidents ever happened. The attorney for the man accused of the massacre of Afghan civilians says that Staff Sergeant Robert Bales himself has no recollection of his killing spree. Understanding the grim mystery of war and surviving its aftermath seems more easily distilled once you scrub away the blood, dirt, and disbelief and expose it to the relentless logic of open and curious minds. This is what we must know. What is it like to kill? What is it like to be wounded or to die? What is it like to watch others wounded or killed in combat? And ultimately, how does one successfully cross the bridge from conflict back to peacetime society? Though, as I've revealed, I'm not a soldier. I've spent most of the last decade in war zones, and the rest of the time trying to understand my experiences there and make sense of them. I both carried the wounded and walked away from the dying. But more than anything else, I've had to watch and bear witness. I've seen the killing of human beings at nearly every point on the spectrum of our existence, from small children to wrinkled octogenarians. I've watched killing from great distances, bombs drop from the sky. I've watched killing within the distance of an embrace, one man executing another. And these images, both as I captured them and as I contemplated them after, have changed me forever. They continue to define me and imbue me with a sense of importance and even swagger, while they also kill me slowly in the moments when I fully consider my complicity. While I wrote this book with a desire to find answers to the questions, it has been hugely difficult, and at times, fruitless quest. My goal was to contact many of the soldiers and Marines who I've reported on in the past, and to trace the arc from that moment of our first meeting to where they are now. Perhaps I would learn that they've experienced some of the same reentry problems as me. It was quite possible they were also grappling with war-fractured narratives of their current lives. I wanted to talk to and learn from them, but I also had information that might help them. I discovered through writing my first book, In the Hot Zone, 1 Man, 1 Year, 20 Wars, and the speaking engagements that surrounded it, that sharing the burden of my wars and the mistakes I made in them helped me, at least initially, to understand and to heal. Surely, if I could get them to tell me their own war stories, it might do the same for them. In my research, I found support for my theory. It was, the experts confirmed, about storytelling, finding a way to release warriors from the bonds of their own silence and help them say the things they felt they could not say. A large part of treating PTSD is simply getting the veteran to remember and talk about what happened to him, writes Marlantes, in what it is like to go to war. And once the talking begins, there's a shift that makes the burden more manageable. Storytelling also knits a community together. It records or recreates the collective history and transforms actors and listeners alike into community witnesses, according to Tick in War and the Soul. He continues, veterans' stories need to be told in a way that transfers the oral weight of the event from the individual to the community. And in his book, Achilles in Vietnam, former Veteran Affairs psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Shea warns about what happens to both soldiers and society when those stories are never told. We can never fathom the soldier's grief if we do not know the human attachment which battle nourishes and then amputates, he says. Failure to communalize grief can imprison a person in endless swinging between rage and emotional deadness as a permanent way of being in the world. But I knew there would be some resistance from these warriors to talking. After all, as a journalist, I was just a few rungs above pond scum in the military hierarchy of value and a few rungs below lawyers in the military hierarchy of trustworthiness. Compound this with the fact that I was also the guy who marred the American triumph in the Second Battle of Fallujah in 2004 when I videotaped a U.S. Marine corporal summarily executing a wounded, unarmed insurgent in a mosque. More on this later. The silence that met my inquiries became deafening. But even with the soldiers and Marines whom I knew, and in whom I had engendered a degree of trust, it was still a difficult process. Fear, I found, was the greatest barrier to the honest sharing of their wartime experiences. Fear of reliving the experience, fear of judgment, fear of consequences, and fear, as psychologist Tick pointed out, of seeing oneself through a prism of innocence lost. In many cases, after I contacted soldiers and Marines, some would initially respond to an email or two from me before slipping away. In other cases, I actually began lengthy dialogues before I lost them to concern about my intentions or the pain our conversations were reigniting rather than mitigating. In one case, I interviewed a former soldier for 2 months. Let's call him Nate. Nate had been deeply scarred by burns following a roadside bomb incident in Iraq. He spoke with me openly and honestly until a conservative businessman and a financial patron of a program that assists wounded veterans mentioned that a journalist like me might not be Nate's best confessor. But eventually, it was the rebellion of Nate's own subconscious that ended our dialogue. He had been in Iraq for a very short period of time before the roadside bomb blew up his convoy. Aside from that incident, he had almost no exposure to combat and its consequences. Additionally, while he remembers portions of the actual incident, because of the severity of his burns, much of his early recovery was spent in a medically induced coma or so heavily drugged that he was barely aware of his surroundings. The upside to his post-trauma haze was an almost total lack of nightmares or other symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. However, after I called him one final time to ask him to reconsider being part of the book, he explained that our extended interviews were beginning to trigger an anxiety he had not felt before. He said he had begun to dream that his hand was on fire and that he couldn't put it out. Prior to our conversations, he said he never dreamed of fire or the incident. At that moment, I realized the limitations of my knowledge. Sharing had helped me with my PTSD, but perhaps there were, to use a medical term, contraindications for talk therapy as well. Dwelling too long or too deeply on past trauma forced someone like Nate to live repeatedly in that traumatic incident rather than just visiting and moving past it. Now I was even more uncertain about the nature and direction of my work. Another case that nearly derailed my convictions about the purpose and importance of this book concerned a soldier whom I'll call Henry. I embedded with Henry's unit at a dry, dirty, and remote combat outpost in southern Afghanistan in the summer of 2006. There are usually two pronounced reactions when a solo journalist embeds in a platoon-sized infantry unit, 30 to 40 individuals. Some of the soldiers avoid you at every turn, assuming, sometimes correctly, that you're just as dangerous as any other battlefield booby trap. Others seek you out, whether for your satellite phone, to bum some cigarettes, or even just for conversation with someone from the outside. Henry was one of the seekers. We would sit on sandbags, smoke and talk in the heat of the Afghan summer night. Henry had a fascinating story, which he told me in great detail, about his life as a teenage gang member. A white kid who joined a set of the Crips on the East Coast. He was selling drugs at 12 and went to jail at 14 for stabbing another gangbanger. He was heading for a bad end, he told me, until a sympathetic judge gave him a choice: prison or the army. The choice was obvious, and in the army he had found a purpose for his unfocused energy and penchant for trouble. In boot camp, he told me he learned discipline from a drill sergeant who had also been a gangbanger and saw through Henry's rebellious nature to his potential. He was thriving doing his job, making friends until he was deployed to Iraq. There, Henry said, while in a patrol convoy, his best friend, a kid named Moreno, was killed by a roadside bomb. Henry blamed himself because he was the vehicle's turret gunner and should have seen the IED, improvised explosive device, before their vehicle hit it. Henry says he was devastated by Moreno's death and wanted payback. He told me that on the next patrol out, when a 10-year-old boy tried to throw a grenade at their convoy, he lit him up with a .50 cal. He didn't stop there. He then trained the weapon on the people lining the road, threading them with the muzzle of the large caliber machine gun. When he stopped depressing the trigger, 9 other people lay dead or dying. Most of them, he told me softly, had nothing to do with the attack. But fuck it, right? That's war, he shrugged. As journalists, we love these kinds of stories of trouble, redemption, and then trouble again. Where would it lead, I wondered? Would Henry's experiences in the army mess him up more than if he had simply gone to prison instead? When I returned home, I interviewed his mom and his girlfriend for the story, but as I began to dig deeper, I became concerned. While some of what he told me checked out, his troubled teens and stabbing another kid, there were also a lot of exaggerated details and some outright fabrications. Henry said that after the stabbing, he was put in an adult prison. But in the state he's from, it's against the law to hold a juvenile in an adult facility, regardless of their crime. Other, more important elements also began to unravel. Most disturbingly, when I tried to find a record of his friend Moreno's death, I had no luck. I emailed Henry asking if he had mixed up the name or the year of the incident. No response. I checked the death records for the entire war, and there was no record of this soldier, period. He existed, I discovered, only in Henry's world. It took months to get him to respond to me by email. When he finally did, I asked him why he didn't just come clean with me, rather than wasting my time with this elaborate lie. He told me it was because he was afraid I would be angry with him. His response provided greater insight than the entire made-up story. Henry's need for attention and approval from an authority figure was so great, he felt he needed to lie to get it. I see it as a small anecdotal signpost for the long-term consequences of sending 18 and 19-year-olds to do our dirty work in war. Infantry grunts like Henry are more often than not man-children who are asked to kill and die before their own sense of right and wrong has fully matured with years and non-war-related life experiences. For me, in writing this book, my time with Henry also reinforced the concept that a war story that sounds too sensational to be true likely is. While the obstacles in gathering the material for this book and deciding what, if any, purpose it would serve were substantial, I decided that society, as well as the soldiers, would be better off for the telling and the knowing. I came to this conclusion after pondering my own experiences, as well as a voluminous amount of clinical and anecdotal research about soldiers re-entering their home societies. Most of it indicated the following. When a soldier decides not to share his life-defining moments in war with his wife, parents, children, or community because of the accompanying guilt, shame, pain, or any other valid reason, it increases the likelihood that he will feel more alienated from the society for which he was fighting, possibly to a debilitating degree. The alcohol, drugs, and other self-medicating outlets for soldiers dealing with PTSD further isolate him from the normal comforts of a peacetime existence, work, family, and friendships, and force him even deeper into the margins of society. Also, without the demythologized, demystified, authentic experiences of war being shared by those most directly involved in it, society itself will remain ignorant of the real practice of war, its costs, and its consequences. A society protected from the reality of war can rewrite the narrative, shaping and forming it into something less terrible and costly, by emphasizing only the heroism and triumphs rather than the dark, ugly deeds that occur with much greater frequency than we care to imagine or discuss. More positively, the warrior who does share the descriptive and often disturbing narrative of his own war experiences reconnects himself to his community, while simultaneously reminding them of the responsibilities that they also bear for his actions by sending him to fight and kill on their behalf. It's rarely an easy message to hear, but it's essential to the positive evolution and enlightenment of the post-conflict society. As Tick writes in War and the Soul, our society must accept responsibility for its war-making. To the returning veterans, our leaders and people must say, "You did this in our name because you were subject to our orders. We lift the burden of your actions from you and take it onto our shoulders. We are responsible for you, for what you did, and the consequences." Stories are a way for societies to share in the burden of war. They provide knowledge necessary to better understand the warrior's experience and help them find meaning and sometimes forgiveness for their actions. Warriors, I've learned, become collateral damage too, killing a little bit of their own humanity every time they must pull the trigger, even though they do so at our bidding. Tim O'Brien wrote so eloquently in his classic Vietnam War novel, The Things They Carried, "A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct, nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it." My goal here is to try to tell the true war stories, not moral ones. The ones found here are entertaining, horrifying, brutally funny, and banal, like so many other experiences, but because they involve war, they bring their own insistent drama that comes with the acts of fatal violence. The warriors brave enough to share them have already lived these stories. Now the communities they fought for need to honestly hear them, wherever they may lead. As I mentioned, I sought out soldiers and Marines I knew and had reported on in the past, but I also found others, including those in the military service of other nations. I found them through veterans groups, military associations, and even medical and mental health professionals. This resulted in a broad base of interviews, providing a sampling of war experiences that ran the gamut from monstrous to mundane. Only a few made it into this book, primarily because I felt either the subjects were the most candid or their individual stories were the most instructive. Regardless, for all kind enough to share, the very act of their participation gave me hope that we may eventually see through the smoky glass of myth, parable, and revisionism to something that resembles the ground truth. On that point, these stories are recollections, oral histories from the perspectives of the men and women telling the stories. Like all who remember, they will remember imperfectly, with omissions and additions, and perhaps lost players and parts. These are not after-action reports or official historical accounts, but the kind of stories that are true to their tellers and imbued with their own perspectives and even judgments. In fact, the primary sources in them are the individuals profiled. It was, after all, their perspective as combatants that I was seeking. They are difficult stories all, and I'm both grateful and hopeful that these acts of sharing will help bring these soldiers and those who surround them some peace.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?